you have your Bibles, turn to Ezra chapter 3. We come to church on Sunday mornings to do one thing, and that's to worship a holy God, right? And I hope the songs have prepared your hearts, and that's what those songs are meant to do. They're not meant to just to sing for singing's sake, but to prepare our hearts for the message that God has for us this morning. And we are going to continue this series in the book of Ezra. And as we do so, I'd really like for us to dwell on what it is that God has done in our hearts, both individually, maybe in our marriage or in our individual families' lives, but also corporately in our church's lives. Now, most of you have been here a lot longer than I have. I've only been here coming up on 3 years here in another couple months, which is crazy in and of itself. But you can dwell upon what the Lord has done in the life of our church over these number of years. And that's what we're going to see culminate in our message this morning. Is at the very end, we're going to see these people's reaction to a 72-year process from being taken out of Jerusalem, watching the city be destroyed, being in captivity under a Babylonian regime for 70 years, and then being brought out of that and brought back to their home, and seeing the rubble that was left, but then seeing a rebuild and a restoration, so to speak. And I want that to be on our minds this morning of our own hearts and lives. Because we've all gone through things in life that we would consider major change, right? I can think of a few things in my own life where I have gone through lots and lots of change. Many of us don't like change, some more than others. And so I want that idea of change, and I want that idea of a period of time and seeing God work through that period of time. Because we're going to see that happen in the people of Israel this morning in our passage in chapter 3. And so keep that in the back of your mind as we and go on in our message this morning. God did all of these things in Israel's time, in Israel's day, specifically the nation of Judah, who we're speaking to this in this book. But God did all of these things after He said He would do these things. Right? Last week we talked about God keeping His promises and how God's words matter. Every single word in this book matters. Every single thing that God has ever said to a human being matters. And everything that God says He is going to do, He is going to do. And those promises in those words that we read in God's book should encourage us and move us forward as a people and as a church. Over the last month or so, in various different ways, our family has had some trying times. Not just in church, just in general, right? Every family has those times, right? And it is God's word and God's promises that have gotten us through those moments. And it is God's words and God's promises that should get us through each of those moments individually and corporately as a church. And so God did this by stirring in the spirit of a king named Cyrus from the from the kingdom of Persia. And God stirred in this king's heart, much like He did in the prior exodus of Egypt. He stirred in the king's heart to take over Babylon, but not just take over Babylon, but to release God's people. And then ultimately to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And that's exactly what happens. God's people are released, and they march back to the old city. And our passage this morning picks up where we left off in chapter 2. We left off in chapter 2 with the march into the old city of Jerusalem. If you remember, verse 68 of chapter 2 says, "Some of the heads of the families, when they came to the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, they made free will offerings for the house of God to erect it on its site." And this verse is going to launch us into our main idea this morning, because I want us to think about the first, and I mentioned this last week, the first thing that the people did when they got to Jerusalem was they made offerings. They made offerings to who? To God, in response to what God had done for the people. They're going to continue that this morning, but what we need to see and what is most important here is this. This is our main idea for our message this morning. That God's people worship Him through the joy of remembering the past, the pain they experience in the present, and the excitement that is to come. That's our main idea this morning. Let me read that again as it's put up on the screen. God's people worship Him through the joy of remembering the past, the pain they experience in the present, and the excitement that is to come. And in order to be able to do that, something has to happen. Something has to return to the city of Jerusalem, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about a return of a people to a city that was once theirs. So if you would, look with me at chapter 3 again. And I want us to look at verses 8 through verse 11. Now, the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, their priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. And Jeshua with his sons and his brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, and the sons of Judah, together supervised the workmen of the house of God, along with the sons of Henadad, and the Levites, and their sons and brothers. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, their priests and their investments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with their cymbals, to praise the Lord, according to the directions of David king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. Let's open in a word of prayer. Father, be with us this morning as we seek to worship You through the preaching of Your word. Lord, rid us of distractions. Lord, cleanse me of sin, rid me of self, that I might be able to preach the word to Your hearers. God, I pray that You would help us to focus on the truth of Your word, help it to reach to our hearts, that it might convict us of sin and turn us to You. Lord, we thank You and we praise You for all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Worship matters. That's what I've entitled this message this morning. Worship matters. There's a reason the first thing that the people do when they get to the city of Jerusalem is offer offerings and begin to worship God. Why? Because they recognize who it is that rescued them. Church, when we come to church on Sunday morning, we say we're going to our worship service, right? We say we're going to our morning service to do what? To worship God. Yet often I think when we come to church, we're not in a mood to worship. We're not in a mode of worship, and I'm the first to say this of myself oftentimes, because when I come out of the house, I'm usually leaving the house with 4 screaming children who are fighting over what to eat, fighting with their mother that they don't want to eat even though they're hungry, And then I watch them run over, and they're beating each other over the head, and they're grabbing backpacks, and Dad is just not in most worship mode, okay? It is a challenge just to get my kids out the door. And listen, I just got to walk them across the parking lot, okay? I understand. I did used to have to drive from my house to church, but we don't have to do that anymore. But you have to drive from your house to church. And so some of you have 15-minute drive, and you're yelling at your kids in the back seat because they won't stop beating each other. And you're talking about what you forgot to turn on the crock pot, so now lunch is going to be cold. And so we have all of these distractions that keep us from worshiping God. And let me tell you, that is exactly what Satan desires. There's a reason why Sunday morning is the most hectic morning of our week. Right? It's not like we don't have to get out the door any other morning. It's that Satan does not want you to get out the house on Sunday morning because he knows what you're about to do. And that is worship a holy God who he desires for you not to worship. And so we have all of these things that come up that cause us to fail to remember what it is that we're going to church to do. And maybe you are cognizant of this, that you come to church to worship, but that is the point of church. Because worship matters to God. And so as I mentioned earlier, there is a reason why the people of God, the first thing they do when they get to the city was to make offerings and to begin to worship him because they remembered who rescued them. Church, every Sunday morning, this is what I want to be my desire as well as your desire, is that we remember who it is that rescued us. Who rescued you out of the pit of despair? Who at your darkest moment lifted you up and brought you to the light? The one that we claim to worship on Sunday mornings. And that is what the people of God remembered, that they were in despair. Their ancestors were in despair and slavery and brokenness in Egypt, and God rescued them and brought them out. And then they were in deep and dark despair in the wilderness, and God rescued them and brought them out. And every single time, the God of the universe rescued them and brought them out, and yet we forget to worship him. And oftentimes, it isn't even on our mind when we specifically come to church to do it. Right? And I'm just as guilty of that, even though I'm the one that's got to get up here and preach. Right? Because I got this on this, I got to talk to so-and-so after church, and I got to catch this person in order to get this done, and this thing, and this thing. But really, it is to just come and to bask in the presence of God and to fellowship with other believers so that we might worship the God who rescued us. And so the people do this. They do not worship Cyrus, though they had every earthly reason to maybe bow down and worship Cyrus, right? Thank you so much, Cyrus. You have nothing to do with us, right? You take over Babylon, but you just as easily could have taken us as your slaves, except for the stirring of his heart by God. That phrase in Ephesians, but God, right? Who is rich in mercy. It is because they recognized God at work that they worshiped him in the moment. And so this morning, we're going to walk through this passage and we're going to see 4 different things that returned to the city of Jerusalem. And not just the people returned. But there are 4 separate things that we see return to the city of Jerusalem that point to one thing. And that one thing is that worship matters. So we're going to begin with the first thing that returns in verses 1 through 3, and that is that the altar returns. So look with me at verse 1. When the 7th month came, and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one to Jerusalem. Then arose Jeshua the son of Jozadak and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, with his kinsmen, and they built the altar of God, of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses to the man of God. They set the altar in its place, for fear was on them because of the people of the land, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, burnt offerings morning and evening. The altar returns. This is important. Why is it important that the altar returns? Remember, the last time they were in this city, they had been taken captive. Right? Everything within the city was destroyed. Their homes, but most importantly, the temple, the place that God dwelled. And so everything in this city was completely wiped out. They were taken in captive, they came back. And the first thing they do is build an altar. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure that the first thing that I would do would be to build an altar. But that's what they did. Think about it. The last time they were in the city, the enemy came, devoured them, burned everything that they knew, and they took them off to captivity. Now they come back, and they build an altar. I don't know about you, but I probably want to build like a wall or something to keep me safe first, right? So that I could even worship on the altar that they're building, right? This seems to make sense. That, human mind would be to protect, preservation, right? Self-preserve, so that I don't die, so that I can do what God has called me to do, and that's to rebuild the city, right? So the wall would be probably the first thing I would do. And if it wasn't the first thing would be maybe to build a house I'm going to live in, right? But they build an altar. And they gather as one unified people and realize the most important thing that we need to do is build an altar so that we can properly offer sacrifices to God. So in the 7th month, we see in the first part of verse 1, the 7th month is important, and we're going to talk about that shortly, but the 7th month was perhaps the most important month on Israel's calendar. The first day of the 7th month was a solemn rest proclaimed with a blast of trumpets, and that starts the Feast of Trumpets. And the 10th day of the 7th month was the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement where they would go and they would sacrifice sacrifice the animal for the sins of the people, right? And that 7th month began a week-long festival with what we know as the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, which we'll get to in a minute. But in the 7th month, they began to rebuild this altar. And Jeshua and Zerubbabel are the leaders who begin the work. And they finish the altar and they set it in the place of where it was. Now, Zerubbabel and Jeshua are important characters. Why? I mentioned this sort of last week in passing. I don't know if you remember it. But Jeshua was of the line of Aaron. All right, do we remember who Aaron was in the book of Exodus? Aaron was Moses' brother, who was where the priests came out of, right? So Aaron was the father of the priestly lineage, descendants, whatever word you want to use. But Zerubbabel was of the line of King David. So we have these two men who God preserved, right, from King David and from Aaron. And so they begin to get to work and to oversee the people who are going to be doing the work of rebuilding the temple. And it's important because Zerubbabel is of the line of David. David was who? The king that reigned in the temple, right? And then we also have, or Solomon. Solomon built the temple, so it was more Solomon, but they came from David because Solomon was David's son, right? But then we have Jeshua, who is the priest who's going to serve within the temple, right? The Levites. And so we have these reuniting of these family lines. All right, so this isn't just, he doesn't just mention these, remember we mentioned in chapter 2, he doesn't just mention all of these names just because, right? There's a reason to why God does what he does, and he mentions all of these families, and these two particular families, because they were of the line of Aaron and of the line of David, and now here they are rebuilding what God had originally started with their their dads, their ancestors, way back in the book of Exodus and following. And so they finished this altar, and they set it in the place of the original altar. So after placing this altar there, they then begin to sacrifice to the Lord again. And they do so, what does verse 2 tell us? Verse 3. It says, they set it in its place. Why? For fear was on them because of the peoples of the land, and they offered burnt offerings to the Lord. They feared, exactly what I brought up earlier. They feared the peoples of the land. Israel was in this day the most hated people on the planet. They were God's people, right? People didn't like them. They wanted to wipe them off the face of the earth. And we see it happen time after time after time after time, right? And so they wanted to get rid of them. And so Israel knew this. They weren't ignorant. They knew that people would want to probably, now they're seeing God's city be rebuilt, and all of a sudden, now there's a problem, right? And so they want to off them. And so that's why my mind would be to build a wall, right? But they didn't. They built an altar. Why? Because they knew that God was the only one who was going to protect them. A wall was not going to protect them. God was going to protect them. Contrary to MAGA, okay, walls are not going to protect us. God the Father is going to protect us, okay? And so if we're putting our faith in a big, tall wall, we're wrong. Our faith is in the wrong place. God is going to protect us, okay? And so they didn't build a wall. They went and offered offerings to their God, okay? Now, I'm not against walls, right? I think we should have walls. They protect us, right? These walls keep us here, right? But it is God ultimately that protects us, and these people knew it, right? And so they offered offerings to the Lord to protect them, and showing that they trust the God they're worshiping to protect them, right? They feared for their lives. Okay? It wasn't that they didn't have fear. They had human emotion. They felt fear. But they recognized that it was God who was going to protect them. And so they sacrificed in showing their trust in God and showing that they remembered what God said he was going to do, and that was he was going to protect them and to keep his promise of furthering his people. So we see the altar return. Second thing we see in verse 4 through 6 is the feasts and sacrifices return. Go ahead and look at verse 4. And they kept the feast of booths, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the rule, as each day required, and after that the burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon, and all the appointed feasts of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. They kept the feasts. Remember how I mentioned the importance of the 7th month. Okay, that is when the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles took place. The Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles was a feast that celebrated what God had done for the people by getting them out of the wilderness, but it was also what God was going to do in the present. And so they continued this feast from their ancestors. Now that this second Exodus had begun, when they celebrate the Feast of Booths, again, they are entering into God's faithfulness in history. They are celebrating not only God's provision and protection in their sojourning in the land after the first Exodus, but they also are recognizing the one that they've just experienced themselves in Babylon. And so they celebrate the feasts, and they celebrate the offerings and the sacrifices that he mentions in Leviticus chapter 7 that he tells them to adhere to, and in Numbers chapter 28. And so hence it was necessary for before the wall to be rebuilt, it was necessary that the altar be restored in order for them to continue the feasts and the sacrifices that God had required of them. And so it's important that we recognize that the altar returns, and that the feast and sacrifice return, so that they can begin to worship God the way in which God required of them back in the law. And so he starts with the altar, continues into the feast, and then thirdly, we see the foundation returns. Look at verses 7 through 9. So they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, food, drink, and oil to the Sidonians and the Tyrians to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to Joppa, according to the grant that they had from King Cyrus of Persia. Now in the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, all the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord, and Jeshua with the sons and his brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, the sons of Judah, together supervised the workmen in the house of God, along with the sons of Henadad and the Levites, their sons and brothers. This leads us right into the gathering of the materials and the resources for the temple. So after they have built the altar and installed the feast and the sacrifices again, now they were able to begin the foundation of the temple. And so they made these free will offerings. If you remember verse 5, they made these free will offerings, and that most frequently describes either the offering of oneself for service, and most often, and in the current context we're reading, the willingness to offer one's resources freely for the temple's construction. And so they made these free will offerings, so they were showing that they were offering themselves to God in service of rebuilding what God had called them to rebuild. And so the people's lives were uprooted and were now coming back to the city, were giving all that they had to the Lord's work in order to rebuild the temple. And they took of that free will offering, and then they paid the workers to ship the wood that they were going to be using for the foundation and for the walls of the temple, and they paid these men to do so. And then it says in the second year, after they're coming to the house of God in Jerusalem, in the second month, all of these men, both Zerubbabel and Jeshua and their families, together with their kinsmen, supervised the workers who were going to build this temple. And this timing is actually significant. So not only is it the second month, which has to do with the feast, but the second month also is the same month that Solomon started building the original temple. And so there's some timing there too, which I thought was interesting. And so after getting all of the workers together, the priests and the Levites come together as well. They were the ones who were going to work in the temple, so not just the ones who were building the temple, but also the ones who were going to work in the temple after it was completed. They get them all together and they begin to work on the foundation of this great building that they were going to build for the Lord and His glory to rest in. And so he also mentions the Levites because they were going to be are going to have a key part in what was going to be the rebuilding of this city and the rebuilding of Israel's story to continue. So they build the altar. They implement the feast again and the sacrifices, the offerings. They build this foundation, and we're going to spend the rest of our time on our fourth point, which is the emotion returns. And this seems kind of interesting, but I want us to look at verses 10 through down to the end of the chapter. It says this, "And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord. For He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever towards Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men, wept, or who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice. And when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. When they see that the foundation has been laid, the people begin to sing. They begin to worship their God. They recognize that all that has transpired over this short period of time is all because of their God. And they begin to sing. And this song that they sing was actually a song that was commanded to them to sing from King David back in 1 Chronicles chapter 16. He says, "Sing, O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." They are affirming that God's love endures forever because God has been faithful to them, starting way back in Exodus when he brought them out of the out of the city of Egypt into the promised land, out of the wilderness and into the promised land, I should say, right? And he will continue to be faithful in the present and on into the future. And so that's what this song is stating. He's helping them recognize that they are singing a song to God, yes, but it is also a song that is to be reminding them of what God has done for them. So a song is just as much as singing praise to God as it is reminding us about who he is. And then we see this. The second half of verse 11. It says, "All the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid." They were praising, right? But look at verses 12 and 13. "But many of the priests and the Levites and the heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of the house being laid." So we have two types of emotions here. We have emotion of joy of this temple now being rebuilt, but we also seem to have an emotion of sorrow and weeping that happens as a result of it. We know it to be we know it to be weeping over in sorrow over what they have seen and what had been. Right? These people, specifically the people that cried, were the people who had been in the old city, Jerusalem, who had seen the old temple. And it says that they shouted so that the people could not distinguish the sound of joyful shout from the sound of people's weeping. So we had two different emotions going on here. The people who did not see the old city, who were joyous that the new city was being rebuilt, but then we had people who had seen the old city who were now weeping of the past that they had seen. Right? Some of those older folks who had been to Jerusalem before they were taken captive were lamenting the fact that the new foundation wasn't going to be the old. We often don't like change. I mentioned that at the beginning, right? And we often weep over the anxiety or over the fear of change or the fear of something new, right? Because we are lamenting the past. We're remembering the past as what it was and the joy that the past brought. But now we are in fear over the pain that the present is bringing. Aren't we? But then there was also excitement at the end. It says that the people shouted with a great shout, that the sound was heard far away. There was some excitement as to what was going to come. Right? So we have multiple emotions. We have excitement about the present. We have sorrow over the past. And we have excitement about what is to come, right? Boy, is that not life. man, the past, I can come up with some great stories, many of which I will not tell from this pulpit, but I can come up with some great stories about what I did in my past, in my past as a kid. Right? Playing at my grandma's house and just all these, cool stories and joy that it brings. Right? But it also brings with it some not fear, but with some sorrow that those days are over. That I'm not ever going to have those days again. And I'm not going to feel the same type of joy that those memories bring, right? And so there's some fear and some anxiety and some pain that we are feeling in the moment, right? Because there's change, and I don't like change, and so I'm scared, but I know that I need to trust God, but there's just some real fear there. And that's okay. We see that with these people who are coming back to Jerusalem for the first time, seeing something new. But then at the same time, there's also excitement, probably some tears of joy as well as some shouting for joy of what God is going to do in the future. God has begun to restore their fortunes as He'd promised. As the whole community makes a new start on the rebuilding of the temple, they experience a mixture of joy and sorrow, joy at their current restoration, but sorrow at what had been lost. You see, in a short period of time, God's people had returned home. They'd rebuilt the altar. They'd reinstituted the feasts and the sacrifices, and they'd rebuilt the foundation of the temple. So much had been done, and all of it was by the hands of their God. And they knew that. They knew that what God was doing was because it was God Himself doing it. But that doesn't change the human emotion, right, that we feel here on this earth. And so hence they felt joy, but they also felt pain and felt fear. And those were real. And we see the emotion play itself out in these people. This is why God deserves to be worshipped. Because God is in control. God is in the restoration business. God is rebuilding His people. In the midst of that, is there fear and anxiety? Absolutely. Those are real emotions. But they cannot usurp the exciting feeling that we should feel knowing that God is in the midst of it. God had a city again. God's city had life again. Yes, there was excitement of the past, and yes, is it good to look into the past and see what God has done and rejoice in it? Absolutely. But they need to live in the present. And they needed to see that God was working in the present, and God is going to do great and mighty things in the future. God's people were renewed again. And ultimately, now they could have fellowship again. So what? What is our application point? This morning I have two. The first being, worship God through the changes of life. No matter what life throws your way, God deserves to be worshiped. We may not enjoy the changes in life, maybe physically, emotionally, family changes. Right? I'm watching, and she'll probably kill me for saying it, but I'm watching my mother go through this right now. Right? My one sister just moved off to Michigan and is building a whole new life up in Michigan teaching, and my other sister just got dropped off at Word of Life on Friday. Right? And on the way home, my mom stopped at our house, and I could see she, doesn't like change, right? Now, those things are exciting, right? They're exciting things. They're not bad, but it's part of life. And God is in control of it all. And God deserves to be worshiped through it. Even though we may not like the things that are going on, many of us are going through physical changes, right? Where maybe we're not able to do as much as we were in the past. And guess what? Who's in control of that? God. And maybe we don't like it, right? But God still deserves to be worshiped in the midst of it. So worship God through the changes of life. And secondly, we need to trust God with the changes of life. Many of us have and are continuing to go through transition periods in our life. My kids are starting to get a little more independent. Not a lot, but a little, right? That's exciting, right? My kids can buckle themselves. I don't have to climb into the back of my van and seatbelt my children. That's exciting for me. Makes getting out of the house a little bit easier, right? But at the same time, that's sad, right? Because that means my little boys and my little girl are growing up, right? But I have to trust that God is in control, right? There's going to be a day where I'm going to have to release my children to the world. Well, release them into the hands of God, obviously, but in this earth world. And I'm going to have to trust that God is in control. That isn't easy. It's hard. But it's a change that we have to go through. Many of us have experienced change in this church, and not just in the last 3 years since I've been here, but many of you have been here through multiple different pastors, right? And multiple different visions for where the church should be going and different things like that, and change is hard, right? But we just have to trust that God is in control and that God is the one working it all out in the end, right? We may not like it. We may not like every little change. We may not like every little thing that God allows to happen in our lives, but all of it is ultimately to get us to a point that we can then worship Him, right, in eternity. Because this earth is not our home. These changes that we're going through aren't even going to compare to the change that we're going to experience when we get to heaven one day. You want to talk about change? That's real change, right? Where we don't have to feel the pain anymore. We don't have to feel the hurt anymore. We don't have to see our kids go through hard times anymore. None of those things. We get to experience what heaven is like in its entirety. We see a glimpse of it here in this book, like we talked about this morning, but we get to experience that in fullness one day. But until then, for some of us it's not very long, for some of us it's a long time. But until then, we need to worship and we need to trust. And as I was reading through this passage all week, those are the two things that came out to me. Was that God's people worshiped Him even though life was chaos around them. You think we have chaos here. Imagine your whole world being turned upside down. And completely displaced from home. They worshiped their God in the midst of all of that. But I couldn't help but see their trust in God in the middle of all of that. They trusted Him. They didn't worry about, now they had real fear, hurt, pain, anxieties, whatever you want to call it. That was all real. It's okay to feel that pain. It's okay to feel that hurt. It's okay to have those fears. But then turn those fears into trust when we realize and recognize who it is that is in control of it all. Why? Because He promised He's going to make it all better. Again, not here. Maybe that time is in eternity. But just worship and trust. Those are the two things that are going to help us move through the changes of life. And some of us are going to experience greater change than others. Some of us, that change is going to have a bigger or a different impact in our hearts than others. But the same thing, or the thing that is the same for all of us, is our response ought to be worship and trust. Worship a God who is steadfast in his love for you, and trust him just the same. Let's close in prayer.